So, welcome to Conservatism. What I'm going to try and do is give an overview of the main currents of thought in conservatism over the past few centuries. Okay, so we've got the key strands in conservative thought here, and then we've got some of our ideas, the key ideas, and some main thinkers or politicians, or even both on the right here. And some miscellaneous quotes and ideas further over here. So, conservatism. Let's start with a simple little quote. Francis Pym, who was thrown out of the cabinet by Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s, he said the wise conservative travels light. And what he means by that is really, in terms of ideology, in terms of theory and ideas and first principles, we should be careful. We should always be pragmatic, because circumstances change. So conservatism is above all a pragmatic ideology that responds to changing circumstances and isn't fixated on a set number of ideas. In fact, pragmatism is the idea that what works is best, that policy should be shaped and adapted according to circumstances, and in that way you can pursue the values which I've put further up. If you want to maintain these conservative values, you need to be flexible in your response, because for a conservative, each situation is unique. Where we get to in the ebb and flow of society is unique, and therefore we have to respond to that situation in time. So the conservatives are wary of universal concepts and principles in the way that a liberal or a socialist in terms of ideology wouldn't be. So this brings us really to these key values. So we could say really that, as Michael Oakeshott said, that conservatism is a disposition. It's a set of values. And we could argue that Mrs. Thatcher probably had that as well. Let's come to Mrs. Thatcher soon. Okay, what do we mean by tradition? So the conservative, particularly thinkers such as Burke, would argue that you need to respect what has gone before and what is going to come in the future. So we need to respect our customs, our heritage, our institutions. A good example being the monarchy. The monarchy provides stability and continuity over time, and that is important for conservatives. So tradition is important, and particularly important, and really the foundation of much conservative thought is the idea of human imperfection, the idea that we are certainly far from perfect morally. In fact, we could have original sin. So Christian thought is particularly important there, but of course that develops in a different way in the 20th century. But the idea that we are morally imperfect, and that in the right, or should I say the wrong circumstances, things can easily go wrong, and society can be rife with crime and disorder. We'll come back to that. Another point about our imperfections, we're intellectually imperfect, and that's why we need to travel light ideologically, because for Burke, revolutions are dangerous things. He liked the English Revolution of 1688 because he saw that maybe more as of an evolution. But the French Revolution really concerned Burke, because that was a complete rational reshaping of society with unforeseen dangerous consequences, which indeed did result. And so Burke's book, which was written in 1790, Reflections on the Revolution in France, was quite prescient, many would argue. And certainly in that he argued that you need evolutionary gradual change and not revolution. Because if we have revolution, it might have completely unanticipated and dangerous consequences. So we've looked at tradition, looked at human imperfection. Another key area is this idea of organic society. Now, a lot of great eminent academic philosophers are very wary of this sort of metaphor, but the idea is that as a society we're not like a mechanism, We're not like a machine. We are like a living, breathing human being, for example. So society is made up of different parts. You've got the head, hands, the heart. Now, if we were to chop one off, that would have disastrous consequences. And so the idea is organisms and people who are fragile. So society is fragile. Because another key point about that is the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts themselves, which is the idea of the organic society. So society is fragile. We must be careful how we implement change. And certainly wholesale revolutionary change based on ideological first principles, based on rationalism, is to a conservative a very dangerous thing. Which just brings us to a key point about authority. Now, to a conservative, a strong government and strong leadership is very important, and you may come across conservative leaders that emphasise this in times of disarray or times of problems. People look for strong leadership, and the Conservatives say that they need this. Why? Because they place a lot of emphasis on Hobbesian ideas. So Hobbes was writing at the time of the Civil War in England, and he said that life without a strong government, without a strong leader, in a state of nature, as he put it, without a clear, strong government, we'd have anarchy, essentially. And for Hobbes, that would be a very bad situation, because according to Hobbes, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not too appealing, really. So the solution to Hobbes was to have any kind of strong authoritarian government. And by authoritarian, we mean rule from above and maintaining clear defence to protect our national interests, and also strong law and order with significant consequences for crimes, so we make an example of people to have a deterrent effect. And that will maintain order, and therefore people will then be able to live without this Hobbesian, scary state of nature, which I've just described in that rather nice little quote. So also for a conservative then, property is important, and property rights are important because they provide stability, security for people, and indeed a stake in society. We mentioned pragmatism, and these are the key conservative values and ideas, what you might call the core concepts. Okay, so although we call them conservative ideas, the name Conservative really came about in 1835 when the Conservative Party was established after the Tamworth Manifesto of Peel. And Peel established the Conservative Party in 1835, partly in response to the 1832 Reform Act. So the idea was the Conservatives need to pick up votes because we were becoming more democratic. But these ideas are still conservative ideas, even if it was called Toryism in the 18th century and the 17th century indeed. So this brings us to the one nation idea. So the one nation idea is that a belief in organic society and a belief that the rich have a responsibility to the poor, and a belief in paternalism. Paternalism is the idea, if you like, that a government should be father-like. It should guide and look after those who are poor, those that are less well off. And indeed the government and the rich and leaders in society have a duty, have an obligation, have a responsibility to the poor and those less well off. And so this is known as the Tory paternalistic tradition. Now Disraeli wrote Sybil in 1845, and his other novel Coningsby, around about that time, in which he talked about two nations, a nation of the rich, basically, or well off, and a nation of the poor. And there was a real divide. Neither spoke to each other, understood each other. So how do we deal with these two nations? Well, some would claim that Disraeli argued that you need a one nation tradition where the government at least intervenes in society and the economy by providing things such as the Factory Acts and housing reform, which Disraeli did. He was Prime Minister in 1868. A more cynical interpretation, or maybe realistic, is that Disraeli realised that with the extension of democracy throughout the 19th century, the Conservatives needed working class votes, and therefore there was a need to appeal to the Conservatives and appeal to working classes to obtain their votes, which indeed Disraeli did successfully do, even against Gladstone. Another view, and Lord Blake would argue, a great Conservative historian, that Disraeli really wasn't a state interventionist in the way that maybe Macmillan was later. Anyhow, as a matter of some debate, of course, but Disraeli is still a paternalistic Conservative and a one-nation Conservative, even perhaps if we question his motives. Because for Conservatives like Disraeli, we'd say there's a moral obligation on the rich to look after the poor, and indeed perhaps a Christian obligation. So, Randolph Churchill is another example of pursuing Disraeli's policies in the 1890s. Then we have the World War I, and eventually we can see in the policies of people like Baldwin a sort of pragmatism in dealing with society and economy. But another strand of one-nation conservatism, which is very significant, is really that of the post-war consensus. I'm talking post-World War II. So after World War II, there was a consensus between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, which is often called Butskellism, which is the idea that we should accept the mixed economy. That's a private sector and a public sector that was nationalised. A welfare state, so that's providing the NHS, free at the point of delivery, healthcare, which was established in 1948, and Keynesian demand management policies to maintain full employment. So the government had some role in planning aggregate demand in the economy to maintain full employment and to prevent recessions. Again, economic interventionism. And many post-war Conservative leaders in the one-nation tradition, such as Heath and Macmillan, were pro-EU and wanted to join the EU, which indeed Heath did manage, of course, in his 70-74 government. Now, Macmillan believed in the third way. By the third way, what he meant was a way between state socialism, stroke communism, and laissez-faire market capitalism. In the middle, you'd have a mixed economy. He believed that government had a responsibility to the poor. And we can see this, for example, in his housing policies, where 1 million council houses were built by the Conservatives in the 1950s. I think Harold Macmillan's target was something like 300,000 a year. And on the mixed economy, okay, the Conservatives did privatise, I think, the road haulage industry and the steel industry, but they kept the rest of Labour's nationalised industries from the 45-51 government. Butskellism refers then to this supposed post-war consensus, and it's named really after Butler, who is a very prominent Conservative senior politician, who developed his education policies and an Education Act named after him, and also Hugh Gateskill, of course, who was the prominent centre-right leader of the Labour Party. So Butskellism, meaning that both parties in the 50s agreed really on the post-war consensus. And this lasted all the way through till we get to Heath, and then what happens in 1975, the Conservative Party elect Mrs. Thatcher. And then in the late 70s, by the time the Thatcher government is formed in 1979, we have a new strand, which is really two old strands coming back, which we call the New Right. So the New Right, very prominent in the United States, takes off in the 60s with Barry Goldwater, and you can see it in the Reagan government of the 80s. Okay, there are two key strands to the New Right. Just before we do that, we can see in Macmillan and Eden, okay, some of these characteristics. A belief in evolutionary reform, a belief in pragmatism to solve the problems of unemployment. Still, there were policies to pursue private property, and still a belief that we should pursue our national interest, but they saw the national interest as us joining the European Economic Community, as it then was. Anyhow, coming back to the New Right. The New Right has two strands. The first strand is really the adoption of neoclassical liberalism, the adoption of the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, which occurred in the 70s. And so some people would try and argue, and you could argue to an extent, that Mrs. Thatcher was a free market liberal and a fundamentalist free market liberal. She has supposedly taken hold of Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, and waved it and said, this is what we believe. But in other ways, if you look at Mrs. Thatcher, she was quite pragmatic. Anyhow, the ideas of neoclassical liberalism are a belief in the free market, belief in market forces, a rolling back of the state, so you reduce the size of states, you have a minimal state, a night watchman state, if you like, but focuses on law and order and defence. Well, of course, the Conservatives found to do that, to roll back the state, is quite tricky. And a belief in controlling inflation, as comes from Friedman, the idea that we should have monetarism, the idea that we should constrict the money supply in order to keep inflation low and control inflation, because inflation was a problem in the 1980s. This means that we basically neglect unemployment. Unemployment rose to a very high level in the 1980s, reaching over 3 million by about 1984. Which of course is the case in the 1930s, which post-war consensus conservatives like Macmillan never wanted to repeat again. An example of policy here will be privatisation. So Mrs. Thatcher privatised council houses and privatised most of the industries that Labour had nationalised in the 45-51 government. Now, some would argue she was pragmatic. She kept well away from the privatising the NHS and said the NHS is safe with us. Well, of course, some people disputed that. She did introduce concepts such as general management into the NHS. She didn't privatise the railways, she didn't privatise the post office. John Major later on privatised the railways, and of course the coalition government under Cameron privatised, I think it's the Royal Mail anyhow, privatised the postal service. So she was perhaps pragmatic, but numerous privatisations took place of British Telecom, for example, of gas, electricity, water, which was quite controversial, but less controversial would be Jaguar, Land Rover, British Steel, etc. Unemployment did indeed rise. Okay, so this strand of the New Right and of Thatcherism, you could argue, is economic liberalism. And you could argue that ideologically, that's certainly different to One Nation conservatism in terms of the economic policies, and it really comes from 19th century liberalism and the ideas of Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, which he wrote in 1776. So, another aspect of this, is, and perhaps less emphasised in the UK in some ways, is the what we call neoconservatism. So this box here is neoconservatism, which is the idea of going back to traditional values, family values, strong state, strong on law and order, strong on national sovereignty, and of course what arises out of that is partly anti-EU streak in the Conservative Party, which sort of developed really from the mid-80s. In fact, we can see a contradiction, and if we just mention the European Union, on this level here, the Conservatives and neoclassical, or neoliberal sets are against the EU because since 1988 in Jacques Delors, the EU moved leftward and had a social chapter and social policies, let alone environmental policies. And conservatives who are neoclassical liberals would see this as too interventionist. On the other hand, conservatives that are of the new right and traditionally believing in a strong national state, in the nation state, also hated the EU interfering in our laws and our practices in the UK. So you could see where the problems with the EU come from. But ironically, of course, it was Mrs. Thatcher that introduced, or sort of pushed for the single market, which was, of course, a free trade and arguably a neoliberal idea. Anyhow, let's move on from the EU. We can see these attitudes, particularly in the ideas of Norman Tebbit, and a reaction against the 60s permissiveness, the idea of free love, free drugs, etc., and relaxation of social laws. So this is particularly prominent in the United States. An example might be Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which prevented the promotion of the idea of gay rights and homosexuality in schools and in lessons. That was repealed later, but not by the Conservatives. So Roger Scruton will be an example of a conservative that espouses traditional values. Now, we can argue then that Mrs. Thatcher and maybe Reagan were economic liberals, but they were social and political conservatives, because again, was there any mention of things such as human rights, or reform of the electoral system, or reform of the House of Lords? Mostly not. In fact, she was a big centraliser, and power was centralised. A good example was the Great Education Reform Bill, which introduced a national curriculum, I think in '88, but in the late '80s. And this is an act of centralisation. So we can see really, in many ways, that Mrs. Thatcher was an economic liberal, but a social and political authoritarian. She wanted power in the centre and control from the centre. And of course, in terms of trade unions, she regarded trade unions and the miners particularly as a threat from within. And she therefore took a strident attitude, if you like, towards the miners, thought it was imperative that they were defeated, and used the law and the police perhaps in a way they hadn't been used before, and certainly in an authoritarian sort of way, many would argue. So in Thatcherism we can see a strong ideological streak of neoliberalism and some new right neoconservatism, such as Section 28 as I mentioned. But we can also see pragmatism. I'll give you an example. In 1980 the miners demanded quite a large pay rise. What did she do? She gave in to it. In 1984 she then took on the miners. Why the delay? Because we had to build up coal stocks till Mrs. Thatcher knew that she could beat the coal miners. On the NHS, as I said slightly earlier, she was pragmatic, saying the NHS was safe with us. She realised that privatising the postal service might be controversial. She therefore moved as far forward as possible. So to what extent was she ideologically driven, and to what extent was she pragmatic? Well, I suppose she was a combination of both, really. But we can see, again, even in Thatcherism, we can see pragmatism, a belief in property, for example, in having a property-owning democracy as well as a sharing-owning democracy. There were policies to encourage property and share ownership, such as the right to buy council houses, which were, as I said, were privatised. A belief in a strong authority, and organic society, I'm not so sure, and certainly belief in human imperfection, need for strong policies on law and order. So, and tradition was maintained, such as the monarchy and the House of Lords, etc. So we can see that these ideas thread our way right through conservatism in many respects, perhaps with different emphasis on different values, which you might expect from a disposition rather than an ideology. And then finally, thank you for still watching, we come to Cameron. So Cameron was elected. He was worried that the Tory party would call the nasty party by Theresa May when she was chairman of the party in the early 2000s. So he came up with this idea of the big society, really Steve Hilton's idea, his advisor. And this is a bit like Burke's Little Platoons. The idea is that social problems could be solved by the community, by charities, by people working together. And by the big society, Cameron said he didn't mean the big state. So he didn't mean collectivism or state interventionism, perhaps. But he did call himself a liberal conservative. And perhaps he meant, and this is a key thing about Cameron, that in terms of social liberalism, there was a big change with Cameron, and gay marriage would be a really good example of a social liberal policy that he introduced against the opposition of many Conservative MPs. Another area to show that the Conservative Party were quite nice, perhaps, is the idea of overseas aid. The overseas aid budget was ring-fenced, as was the NHS budget, was ring-fenced by Cameron. So this, in one sense, that is one nation conservatism, but in another sense, dealing with fiscal austerity. So there were huge cuts in the size of the government. But would you say that's pragmatic? Because Conservatives in 2010 said we can't support a situation where the government's borrowing £168 billion and the budget deficit is around 10% of GDP. So something had to be done about that. Now you could argue that's pragmatic, or you could argue it's neoclassical liberal and you believed in a smaller state, because certainly the size of the state as a percentage of GDP was constrained and began to fall under the Cameron government. So we can see a mixture of pragmatism, and we can see still a belief in property through various right-to-buy schemes. We can also see pragmatism as well as neoclassical liberalism. And of course the idea of burdening future generations with debts is not really a conservative principle, not a Burkean principle, where conservatives believe you need to conserve and you need to take responsibility for your world and not place debts on future generations. Okay, this brings us to May. So in 2016 we have Theresa May. Well, she can perhaps be seen as more socially conservative because she certainly wants to control immigration, and she certainly wants to get away from the European Court of Justice. She's also quite keen on the idea of grammar schools. Now, many of these ideas come from a guy called Nick Timothy who advises her. Also, she seems economically interventionist, because a good example might be the idea of having an industrial policy. She's tied with the idea of interfering in the energy market. And certainly with Cameron and May, what you can see is a rise in the national minimum wage to help those on low wages. So is that pragmatism, or is it a streak of, or as well as a streak of sort of one nation conservatism? So grammar schools were rejected as an idea by Cameron, but they've come in under May, perhaps because she went to one. And that could be seen as social conservatism in terms of education policy, but she would claim to be a one-nation conservative. But could you claim to be a one-nation conservative and still have fiscal austerity? This fiscal austerity has run on from 2010. So I hope this provides a really useful, maybe interesting, overview of conservative ideas. Thank you so much for watching.